Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a creepy collection of ghost stories for you to listen to, but before we jump in I have a bit of an announcement. Next week is my birthday week, so every day we're going to have brand new stories from Monday to Friday and something special on Saturday, my actual birthday. So be sure to tune in next week for lots and lots of horror. Don't forget to download our app if you're so inclined, called Mort's Bedtime Stories, for over 5,000 stories and no ads. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I live in Pennsylvania, and this happened to me when I was around 5 or 6, so around 1995. At the time my father was working as a delivery driver for a local bakery, and since he couldn't afford a babysitter, he would take me along with him on his deliveries. We would go to the bakery early in the morning, and I would play in the back room with my toys while he loaded up the bread into the van. Then we'd spend the better part of the day driving all over the place delivering bread to all the stops on his route. One day we stopped at a place called the Stone Tavern. I think it was the last stop on our route that day, or maybe my dad just wanted a drink after work. I remember that we were there for longer than usual that day. Dad was talking to a friend at the bar and I was doing whatever I was doing, when suddenly the need to use the bathroom overcame me. I asked my dad where the bathroom was because we never usually stopped there for that long, so I'd never needed to use it before. Now I need to add some context for this next part because I feel it's important. I had an imaginary friend at that age, but I knew they were just imaginary. At no time did I ever confuse them as being real, nor did I ever actually see them. I also have a history of taking some really long turds. Even back then, it still happens today and it's pretty normal for me. I'll be there 15 or 20 minutes pushing one out. I'm not sure why, but my grandfather was the same. When I was that age, I would sometimes really hurt myself and sit on the toilets for minutes on end. To make myself feel better, I would pretend that my imaginary friends, the most common which was Raphael, my favorite Ninja Turtle, would walk in and comfort me and tell me it was gonna be alright. Silly, I know, but that's what got my childhood self through those tough bathroom sessions. Dad points to a large wooden door directly across from the bar and tells me, "The bathroom's down there." I open the door and am greeted by a flight of grey stone steps. The bathroom was essentially a small basement area. It was only one room with concrete walls. The wall across from the stairs was barren, and to the left of the stairs was a small sink with a mirror, and a single light above it cast itself onto the opposite wall. There was a urinal next to this, and then a divider for the toilet stall which was right up against the wall. There was no door to the stall. I think because it was meant to be a one-person bathroom, there was no window and no other exits. The only way in or out of this bathroom was through the door at the top of the stairs, and the only light came from the bulb above the mirror. So there I was, sitting on the toilet doing my business with nothing to look at other than the wall from across the stall. I don't fully remember how it started, but at some point I saw the shadow of a man in a straw hat appear on the wall. For that shadow to be there, the man must have been standing on the opposite side of the divider to my right, directly in front of the sink, and just out of my line of sight. I remember that he talked to me, but I don't remember much of what he said. I just remember that he had a comforting voice. I never felt threatened or like I was in danger in any way. I remember that the man on the wall was trying to make me laugh, had asked me if I liked cats, and then I noticed that the shadow of a cat had appeared on the wall beside his shadow. The most vivid part of this experience in my mind was when he pulled out a yo-yo and began playing with it, and the shadow of the cat swiped at it. I remember laughing and feeling completely at ease. At some point, the man in the straw hat told me that I had to go. Not that he had to go. Specifically, I remember that he told me, "You have to go now." Then the shadow of the man and the cat slowly faded away. I cleaned up, flushed, rounded the divider to find myself alone in the bathroom. I washed my hands and went upstairs. My dad looked down at me as I exited the door and said something along the lines of, "That took you longer than usual, buddy, you alright?" I remember telling him I was talking to the man with the cat. He got this weird, borderline terrified look on his face, and I remember a few people nearby stopped talking to listen to me as well. "What man were you talking to, buddy?" "The man on the wall, Daddy." To this day, I've never seen an expression like that on my dad's face. I remember that he told the bartender to keep an eye on me, and then he and a few other people rushed for the stairs and ran down to the bathroom. When they came up, my dad still looked a bit shaken, and I remember him and the other people there asking me questions, but I don't remember what they asked or what I answered. Eventually we went home and I moved on with my life. But about a year or so later, I remember my dad brought it up again, and he asked me if I still remembered that experience. From what I remember, he told me that another child had seen the same ghost or whatever, and it had been in the newspaper. I don't have that newspaper anymore, but I vividly remember reading it and thinking, that's not what I saw. This girl's account didn't match up with what I'd remembered seeing. However, the article did mention that another child claimed to have seen this ghost just last year, which I believe was referring to my own experience. I don't really believe in ghosts, but that experience has always stuck with me. I know it wasn't something I just made up to push through the pain of using the bathroom. I also know there was no possible way anyone else could have been in the bathroom with me. The only door to the bathroom was directly across from my father in a crowded tavern. I've done some light investigating in recent years, usually whenever this story pops into my head. But I've never been able to find that newspaper article about the little girl who saw the ghost in the basement of the bathroom of the Stone Tavern in Pennsylvania. I don't even know if that place is still around. I think it closed for a bit at some point. And still, it remains my only real ghost experience. I had just turned 22, and my parents sold their house and purchased a place out in the country. On the property there was a big shed not far from the house that I decided to turn into my place. Now I felt kind of uncomfortable in the shed sometimes, but my dog kept me company, so it wasn't that bad. I had been in there maybe 2 weeks, and one night I'm on the computer, my dog asleep at my feet, and I need to pee. So I get up and go outside to piss. It's a beautiful clear night, and the stars were incredible. Next thing I know, the shed door slams behind me. I turn immediately and try to open it, but it won't budge. Now from inside the shed I can hear my dog start to growl, quietly first, then louder, then he's barking, and I'm panicking trying to get the door open. I must mention that I'm 6'5", well built and play sports, but even ramming my full weight into the door wouldn't open it, and I'm really panicking now as my dog's barks turn to whines, then whimpering, then silence. And with all my might, I slam into the door and now it flies open. The light is off inside now and it's pitch black. It won't turn back on and I'm in complete darkness. I can't see my dog anywhere and I stumble around trying to find a torch. Finally I find it. I pick it up, turn on my torch, and I wasn't prepared for what I'd seen next. My dog had literally squashed himself into the furthest, darkest corner of the room, eyes closed, shaking violently. I immediately moved towards him, and as soon as I got within reach, he leapt at me into my arms and wouldn't move. I picked him up and I swear I've never ran so fast in my life. I never stepped foot in that shed again, and my dog won't even go near that part of the property. I don't even know what happened in that shed that night, but I will never forget it. This occurred in 2016, and I was a hardcore atheist at the time. I was raised Baptist, but was never allowed to have a Ouija board growing up. So after becoming an atheist, I decided to buy one just for the fun of it, still believing that any movement would be a result of the ideomotor effect. I played around with it, not much happened. So I just put it back in the box and shoved the box under mine and my boyfriend's bed. 2 or 3 nights later, I woke up to what sounded like a violent scratching/clawing noise and what felt like the bed shaking. And you know when you wake up because you think you heard something? You hold your breath so you can hear better in the silence? Well, that's what I did. I held my breath, terrified, and it was strange because it was almost waiting for me to let my guard down, because as soon as I exhaled and thought, oh, it was just a dream, the scratching and crawling picked up again. It was so forceful, it was shaking the fricking bed with each scratch. So obviously it freaked the hell out of me and my boyfriend, who I woke up, as he was asleep next to me, while the scratching paused again. As soon as I shook him awake, he could tell I was just terrified by the look on my face. He started to ask me what was wrong, and I just shushed him and whispered, "Shh, listen, just tell me you hear it too." And we're both sitting there in silence, and once again, it was as if I was waiting for our guard to lower, because as soon as my boyfriend said, "Hear what? I don't hear," the scratching suddenly picked up 10 times harder, faster, and louder than it had before. My boyfriend was braver than I. He immediately hopped out of bed, switched on the light, and was yelling, "What the hell was that?" As soon as the light flicked on, it stopped. I immediately looked for a rational cause. I didn't have any animals at the time, no kids, nor TV or radio on. We lived in a brick house, so nothing could get in the walls. By ourselves, in the suburbs, so no weird animals or anything like that. There was simply no explanation. My boyfriend looked under the bed. He looked around the house. He even looked around the outside of the house, just trying to find some explanation. But we couldn't find one. So my boyfriend and I eventually get back into bed. We snuggled up close, and then he reached over to turn the light off. We laid there listening for any hint of movement, and of course, as soon as my boyfriend relaxes and says, "I think it's gone now," the scratching and clawing start picking up even more violently than before. At this point, we turned every light in the house on and went to sleep in the living room. The next experience happened a month after the first. My boyfriend was such a heavy smoker. He would literally wake up every few hours throughout the night to go smoke outside on the back patio. I'm a light sleeper, and I would often wake up when he went out to smoke, and then wake up again when he came in, and crawled back into bed. It was around 2 a.m, and I heard my boyfriend get up and out of bed. So I'm trying to fall asleep, and I hear him put his shoes on. I hear him open and close the bedroom door, and I heard his footsteps walking down the hallway. I hear him open and shut the hallway door. I hear him open and shut the back door. I hear the back screen door open and shut too, all totally normal. I didn't know how much time had passed, probably not that long because I never fall back asleep all the way. But maybe half hour later I heard the screen door open and shut again, along with the back door. I heard the door at the end of the hallway open and shut, and I heard his footsteps walking down the hallway towards the bathroom, a bit heavier this time as if he was stomping for some reason. Then I heard our bedroom door open and shut. Normally at this point I would be hearing my boyfriend crawl onto his side of the bed, as he slept right next to the door, while I slept on the other side by the wall with my back to the door. But instead I hear him still stomping around the bed and walking up to my side all the way up to the desk and stop right there, standing right in front of my face. My eyes were still shut, and I was still lying there on my side facing where he was standing, but still trying to fall back asleep. I figured maybe he was putting his phone on the charger, as the outlet was by my pillow. But I couldn't hear him mess with the cables. I couldn't hear anything. I suddenly felt like there was someone just staring at me, watching me. That's when the terrifying thought crossed my mind. Why is he just standing there in front of my face, doing nothing except watching me sleep? And I got this sinking feeling in my stomach. Then I heard a voice whisper my name and telling me to wake up. It almost sounded like my boyfriend, but the voice was deep and raspy and almost distorted. I opened my eyes, and despite hearing him walk in and open and close the doors and walk around to my side of the bed, there's no one there. I jump out, jumping out of bed and running down the hall to find my boyfriend, and once I turn a corner to go running through the living area where the exit to the back patio is, I literally run into, like physically collide with my boyfriend. Turns out he was in the process of running inside to find me, while I was in the process of running outside to find him. Before I can even gather my thoughts to turn them into words, he asks me where I was, if I'm okay, and if I heard it. Apparently he didn't know what happened, that he just came out to smoke and must have fallen asleep in the hammock, because the next thing he knew, he heard the patio door and screen door open and shut, and it half woke him up, and he was still trying to sleep. But then he heard me walk up, and felt someone sit down on the hammock with him, and allegedly put their hand on his leg. Then he heard them say his name, and then I apparently yelled, but that he knew it wasn't my voice, and when he opened his eyes there was no one there. So long story short, we both had the same unique experience at the same time in different areas of the house, both of us thinking at first it was the other person, for us to only realize at the exact same time no one was there at all. Which begs the question, who did both of us hear walking around the hall's patio and bedroom, if none of us did it? This next story occurred 5 months after the experience you just listened to. Since then, I actually had made quite a lot of progress on the Ouija board, and you could say I befriended the spirit in the house, Griot. It's a long story, but basically I told it out loud, if you want it to stare, you can make all the noise you want in the daytime, but not at night, because it scares me. Take it or leave it. And it worked. I worked hard to communicate over time and build a rapport of sorts, but those are stories for another day. The point is, the spirit was no longer terrifying us and became more of a welcomed, although pranking presence. But keep in mind, in my head, I still partially believed I was just going insane, and that none of this was real. Imagination, idiomotor effect, gas leak, brain tumor, mental illness, the atheism in me was strong. Around this time, my boyfriend, who had been in a long-term recovery from heroin addiction, ended up relapsing. I knew it, as I was in long-term recovery myself, and I knew all the signs, but he wouldn't admit it. I knew the only way he would admit it and go back to rehab is if I found evidence and confronted him with it. When he left for work one night, I knew it was a chance to find evidence. He would never take syringes to work with him, so I knew they had to be in the house somewhere. I searched for several hours, as I was frantic, but after finding nothing, I was in tears, sobbing and desperate. So I had an idea. In absolute desperation, still in tears, energy still very high, I pulled out the Ouija board and thought, this is my last shot, here goes nothing. While also at the same time kind of viewing it as a test to see if my paranormal experiences were legit or not. Once I contacted the prankster spirit, I asked if he had seen or would know the location of something my boyfriend had hidden recently here in the house, perhaps a baggie or syringes. When the planchette moved to yes, I broke down and straight up said, please, I need help. I need to know where he hid those things so I can save his life. I swear to God, if you help me find them, I will never ask you to find anything for me again, or another favor. Please, where should I look? And I'll admit, I felt like a crazy person. But to my surprise, it started to spell out a list of words. It spelled out basket, basement, trouser, laundry, fleece, sock, pocket. And that was it. The atheist doubt in the back of my mind, thinking of the idiomotor effect, thought, that's a strange list for my subconscious to spell out. I don't even use the word trouser, and we don't own anything fleece. I searched for 90 minutes straight, and was about to give up, but when in the laundry room of my basement I saw a basket underneath the rocking chair that I hadn't noticed before. It was a box of pants, or trousers you might say, all belonging to my boyfriend. I dug through and got to the last pair of trousers in the basket, and under the chair in the laundry room of the basement was a pair of jeans. And I kid you not, in the pocket, I pulled out a fleece sock that I'd never seen before, and wrapped inside the sock, I found 2 syringes and several empty gel capsules, what dope comes in around here. Once I saw that, a shiver went down my spine, because I realized everything was actually real. The truth of spirits and the afterlife hit me in the face like a bunch of bricks. I wasn't crazy after all. That was the proof that spirits were real, because I could have never known that. Not a single word was incorrect from the Ouija board, like I suddenly got the most terrified feeling ever, just knowing that the spirit I was speaking to was real, and was certainly watching me make this discovery, watching me stand there frozen in fear and awe, and realization as I looked around the basement. I thanked it. And yes, that discovery did propel my boyfriend and eventually fiancé into treatment. Unfortunately, in late 2017, my fiancé relapsed one more time and passed away. But thanks to that spirit, I got to spend a few more years with him. Otherwise, I would have lost him before then. These are my biggest and most life-changing experiences with the paranormal. I know what I've experienced, and won't waste a single second trying to convince anyone who doesn't want to believe me. All I know is that it was enough to convince me. When my niece was really young, she was in a bouncer at my sister's house. I was house and babysitting, and I had left to go to the kitchen to grab some water. My sister's chocolate Labradors were probably sniffing and licking her head, because I could hear her giggling like she was having a blast. I hadn't noticed how cold it had gotten. Then I heard it, a loud wooden snap, like a thick piece of wood had been snapped in half suddenly, or a tree had been knocked over. I ran into the room, and what I saw and smelled freaked me out. The dogs were huddled in the corner whimpering. My niece was just staring at the ceiling corner with wide eyes, and it was cold and smelled like Stenston. I took her and we decided to go to a different room. When my sister finally came home, I told her what happened, and she just rolled her eyes and said, "Oh, that's Hugh." I was confused. She said Hugh was the previous owner of the house who had perished 10 years before his wife sold it. She said he likes to follow my niece around, and you can tell it's him because the dogs freak, and they get cold spots and it smells like cheap cologne. I don't believe in that stuff, but I do believe that feeling you get in your gut when something doesn't feel right, despite knowing that I experienced this. My grandma gave me her husband's car, a '62 Fury, shortly before she passed away. I had no clue how to start the car at the time, let alone drive it with a stick on the column. So the car was left in the garage for some 7 years until a friend offers to help me out, and we spent almost 2 years going in and out trying to fire it up to no avail. The car would crank but not start at all, fire up but shut down immediately, and all the time both were trying to make it run, it just wouldn't, like it didn't want to. Then Corona came, and one day out of the boringness I went to the garage, keys in hand, put a booster on the battery as my friend and I did hundreds of times, put the key in, cranked it, and it started like it had just been parked there yesterday. I left it idle, and it was running for over an hour, and then out of nowhere the smell of my grandpa's cologne filled up the whole house, so much that my mum came out and said, "It's like he came back just to see you driving it." So I think my grandpa didn't like my friend and was protecting his car, and would only make it run with someone from the family. At least, that's what I think. When I was young, my grandfather rented us a movie to watch, Dirty Dancing. He shut the movie pretty quickly once he realized it wasn't super appropriate for 7-year-olds. Fast forward a few years after he passed away, I was homesick and my mum rented me a VHS to watch, and you guessed it, it was Dirty Dancing. I remember not seeing past the part he had shut off, and as soon as I got to the part the VHS ejected. I am now 29 and have still not seen the full movie out of respect for my grandfather. My grandpa passed away 3 years due to pneumonia. The day before his death, he was in the hospital, and me and my brother and uncle were outside his room. It was around midnight when my brother and uncle went to a store near the hospital to get something to eat, and I was there alone, and dozed off on the bench for 10 minutes. And when I woke up, I saw an old woman leave my grandpa's room, so I rushed into the room to check on him, and he was sleeping. I came out and saw the woman walking towards the exit, and I couldn't see her face, but she was wearing the same clothes that my grandma was wearing the day she passed away, 5 years before this happened. My wife and I were about to go to sleep. She was already in bed while I was standing up folding my clothes and getting ready to go into bed as well. I look at my wife and I heard it. A crystal clear voice of a child that whispered, "Hello." My jaw was down on the floor while I was trying to ask my wife what the hell that was. She didn't hear anything, but I heard it very loud and clear. My wife figured out that something spooky happened, but I couldn't speak. I was having chills all over my body, and I tried to get down to bed. I then wrote the whole thing down on my phone and showed it to my wife, who got the chills also. The voice came from right behind her, and still she couldn't hear it. The child sounded happy and welcoming. I did not feel threatened to leave, but I couldn't sleep very well. I was way too spooked and excited. Lately, there have been a lot of strange things happening in our home. For example, someone always pulls the plug to the computer and the lamp in our home office. We can see the office from our living room, and sometimes the light turns off and no one's been in there. Whenever we go in there, the plug is half out, so you don't see directly if it's off, like someone's pranking us. I believe this to be the phantom child that's among us. This happened when I was 16. We lived next to this old abandoned 2-story house that had at one time been a boarding house or hotel. I had only ever seen one family move into that 2-story house in all the time we lived next to it. They stayed there for a few months but then left rather suddenly. By the time of this event, the house had been abandoned for years. I had gone out to feed my dog Rowdy after dinner, and it was starting to get dark. Now normally Rowdy came running up to me as all good boys do, but this night he stood at the fence, growling towards the 2-story house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I spoke to Rowdy, and he looked up at me and wagged his tail. Then he immediately positioned himself between me and the house next door and resumed his growling. I looked towards the house, not really noticing anything at first. Then I looked up towards one of the 2nd-story windows, and there, looking back at me, was this tall, thin figure staring. His face was gaunt and pale, with eyes that were sunk and a glimmering red sheen to them. For a moment I thought they blinked. The hair was long, white and scraggly, and dressed like someone straight from the 1800s. Like of how Kurt Russell was dressed in Tombstone, that would be very close. Upon seeing this, I ran for it, vaulting over the fence and clambering into my home. I don't even remember opening the screen door. My dad took one look at me, and I could see the concern on his face. I told him of what I'd seen, leaving out the part about the blinking red eyes, as I wasn't sure I had actually seen them or not, and he immediately picked up his phone and called the cops. It took a little while for them to arrive, but when they did, they took my statement and told me it was probably just some kid or a vagrant. They went into the house and sometime later returned to tell us that there were no signs that the house had been broken into, but there were no signs of anyone being there recently either. It was suggested that I, a 16-year-old, had just imagined that, or that it was a reflection of a passing car, as far as the adults were concerned anyway. It took a few days to muster up the courage, but when I did, I went to have a look for myself. I simply had to prove to myself that I wasn't seeing things, or hoped that I was. The front door was locked, but the back door was still ajar, but only just. It took some doing, but I managed to force it open. The bottom of the door scraped along the floor as it did so. The floor itself was coated with a layer of dust and detritus, but I could make out footprints here and there where the cops had made their way through the house. The place smelt musty, with a hint of mold and rat droppings. In the corner of one of the front rooms, it looked like someone had been squatting in the house. An old camp lantern, a sleeping bag, and some discarded clothes and some trash. You could tell that these items hadn't been used recently, and the rest of the house proved to be empty save for a few pieces of old furniture, lots of cobwebs, and even more dust. I followed the footprints upstairs and I found the room corresponding with my window where I had seen the gaunt figure. Immediately every hair on my body pricked, and I got an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that I should not be there. My fight or flight was in overdrive, but couldn't figure out which way to go. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and that certainly didn't help my current state of mind, but I persevered. I grit my teeth, and then walked towards the window, half expecting something to jump out at me, but nothing did. When I got to the window, I stood there for a moment looking down into my own backyard. I could see my dog tossing his food bowl around and chasing after it. Across the way, I could see cars going over the railroad tracks, and their brake lights lit up as they slowed down to cross them. I thought to myself, maybe I just did see a reflection. The brake lights would certainly explain the red eyes I saw, but not the face, and certainly not the tall figure with his dress from the 1800s. I had almost convinced myself that none of it had been real, and was about to turn to leave, when I saw, just for the merest sliver of a split second in broad daylight, an image of the man I had seen in the window. It was almost like I was looking in a mirror, except the face I saw wasn't my own. Had I blinked in that moment, I would have missed it, but I hadn't. In a jolt, my fight or flight made up its mind, and I, as they say, vacated post-haste. This event triggered a series of serial nightmares lasting several years. Not every night, mind you, but every month or so I'd have a nightmare picking up from where the last one left off. And to this day I can still recall the image of the ghostly figure well enough to describe everything about him, right down to the brownish paisley pattern on his vest. Now, dear listener, what do you think? Did I imagine it? Or might I have seen something? This all started when I was around 10 and my sister Kat 7. We lived in Illinois, our family being my parents, my 2 brothers, Kat and myself. We went to visit Grandma Ruth for Christmas. She was my dad's mum who lived in Alabama. One evening we went up to Cumberland Mountain to see my great-grandmother Bessie. Kat and I were napping in her feather bed, and when I felt her sit up, she started talking. We usually shared a bed at home, and sometimes she would talk in her sleep. I sat up brightly and asked her who she was talking to. Without facing me, she said, "Willie." "Who's Willie?" I inquired. "He's right there, at the foot of the bed." I couldn't see anyone. "He's wearing a red flannel shirt and overalls, curly hair." Still looking towards the end of the bed, she said, "Okay," then laid down and went back to sleep. I got up and told my dad and Grandma Bessie, who were in her living room, what had just transpired. They looked at each other, and she said quietly, "She's got it." I found out later that it meant being sensitive to spirits. A short while after, Kat got up and stood in the bedroom doorway and informed Bessie, "Willie said he loves you, but he has to go now." and went back to bed. Not 15 minutes later, there was a knock on her front door. It was a despondent young man in his 20s who lived with his family down the road. He told us that his son had just passed away from a fever, and he would take naps in her feather bed when Bessie sometimes watched him. His name was Willie. This was our first taste of the paranormal. Kat, as it turned out, is sensitive. Not just sensitive, in fact, more like a magnet for spirits. In the 1960s to early 70s, my family and I lived in a 3-street neighborhood between a soybean farm and Cahokia Mound State Park in Illinois. It was a great place for kids, and there were a bunch of us who would gather in the park to play, climb the burial mounds and Monk Mound. Archaeological students from Southern Illinois University were always at the park digging here and there. Look it up, it's very interesting. There were signs at the base of some of the mounds warning against climbing them as the tops could be unstable. But being kids, we did so anyway, and nothing ever happened to us. All the neighborhood homes are now gone, having been bought back by the state to build a cultural center to expand the park back in the 1980s. When I was 12, I was home from school with a bad head cold. My sister and brothers were in school and my parents were at work. It was January. Over the weekend it had snowed enough to cause some driving problems, but not nearly enough to call a snow day from school. As I headed to the kitchen for some water, I glanced out my bedroom window facing our backyard. My dad had planted 2 weeping willow trees there. Their long tendrils gently sway in the breeze, green and beautiful, as in spring I saw a young Native American woman, probably in her late teens or early 20s, walking across our backyard about 50 feet from our house. I wasn't frightened, I was used to seeing and hearing odd things. The woman was wearing a fringed and bladed buckskin dress. Her long, dark hair was braided, and she carried what appeared to be a sheaf of wheat in her arms, heading towards one of the willows. I waved. She stopped, turned her head towards me and cocked it slightly, as if to comprehend what she was seeing, then continued on her walk, disappearing into the slightly swaying green willow branches. Wait, it's the middle of winter. I rubbed my eyes and opened them again. The outside was still blanketed in 6 inches of snow with steel grey clouds, with only a whisper of a breeze. What did I just see? It couldn't be a dream because I hadn't been asleep. A daydream? I had been reading a book on horses at that very moment. Anyway, I didn't tell anyone. It was just an occasional thing. When I turned 15, we had moved, and my mum brought a small statue about 1 foot tall for my birthday. It looked exactly like the woman I'd seen a few years earlier. I still have it to this very day. In 1988, while living with my parents in a house in an Oklahoma City suburb, I was in my room with my niece, finding a book for her to read. She and my sister were visiting. We heard a glass-like crash from the kitchen and hurried into the room to find a small ceramic cow butter dish for a stick of butter I had made in ceramics class, that I had taken with my sister a few years earlier. The base of the butter dish was still sitting on the shelf, but the top was 6 feet away where it had been shattered on the tiled floor. They called out, "What was that?" We looked at each other, let out nervous giggles, and went into the den to tell my parents and sister that we had a ghost. Now I can just hear a lot of listeners in the next call BS, as I probably would have had I not been there. In 2001, shortly after my husband and John and I were married, we were watching a NASCAR race on TV one Sunday afternoon. Lucky, my cockapoo I got from my dad a few years before I met John was lying on the couch between us. A couple of hours earlier, I had unpacked books, knickknacks, and about 100 videotapes, 97 to be precise, as this was before we got DVDs. The tapes were arranged alphabetically on the top 2 shelves of a 4-shelf bookcase in our spare bedroom, which I used to set up a library and small studio for my artwork, a bookworm and artist in residence. I was taking a break from unpacking when suddenly an orb about 5 feet off the floor, about the size of a basketball, an orange, whitey, yellow in color, sparkling and crackling a 6-foot trail behind it, came from the hallway to our right, passed in front of us, quickly turned, and went back into the hall that led into the kitchen, bathrooms, and 2 bedrooms. As we watched the orb in amazement, we looked at each other and saw that Lucky had witnessed it too. A few seconds later, we heard a loud crash from the spare bedroom. Lucky whined but refused to budge as John and I rushed in to find all the videotapes lying face down in a pile on the floor. These tapes were set a good 8 inches from the front edge of the shelves. All of the tapes were out of their sleeves, face down in the pile, except one lying on top. There were no open windows that would let in a strong breeze. No one else was in the house to prank us, no earthquake that would have shaken all the tapes onto the floor, and how on God's green earth could all the tapes get out of their sleeves and end up piled 3 feet from the bookcase in a matter of seconds? Amid the alphabetized tape sleeves still on the bookshelves, one empty slot was evident. It was where the sleeved, front-facing videotape on the pile should have been. It was that for the movie Ghost. That night I dreamt of a girl of around 8 years old. She was wearing a long yellow flowered dress. Her piercing blue eyes were bright under her blonde curls, and she said her name was Sarah, and that she used to live in this house a very long time ago. And then she was gone. I awoke to the heavy scent of lavender. We don't care much for that fragrance as it messes with my sinuses, so that was strange. It faded soon after, and I didn't have another incident in that house. My sister had moved into my room after I got married and experienced many occurrences of stomping, wall banging, voices, and things being moved about. As I mentioned before, she's a sensitive, and prior to moving in with our parents, Kat had lived in an apartment not far from our house. I gave her a small digital voice-activated recorder when she told me she had been hearing things in the apartment. She had captured some outrageously creepy things on it. One weekend, my older brother and his 3 children were spending the night with her while visiting from out of state. It was still dark outside. He was awoken by a pressure on the couch where he was sleeping. Thinking it was one of the children, he woke up to find no one. Everyone was still asleep, and he bolted up, rushed into Kat's room and told her, quite rattled, "I can't stay here, it's haunted," and that they had to get out. She was startled awake, confused, until he told her what had happened. They packed up and left in minutes, and went to our parents' house a few blocks away. He never returned to her apartment. Kat got recordings of a man in her room at our parents' house. One afternoon, she was getting ready to run some errands and switched the recorder on. As she was leaving, she saw the blinds in her window move. 2 slats were separated in 2 places as if someone were peeking out. One was the height of a small child, the other of an adult. She peeled out of the driveway. Upon returning, the recorder was still on, and playback revealed sounds of someone rummaging and slamming drawers, but nothing had been moved. She got a recording of a small boy saying, "I won't be home for dinner," and a man's deep voice saying, "She's mine." It still creeps me out when I listen to it. This is but a taste of the stuff my family and I have experienced throughout our years. For all I know, there are far more creepy things in store for us in the near future. This happened when I was home all by myself. It was just me and the dogs. I was just there chilling with my animals when all of a sudden I heard an audible, "Hey!" It just came out of the silence. My dogs from upstairs started crying and barking, and suddenly whimpering. I grabbed my shotgun and head up. They were crying and clawing on the door, and I threw it open knowing my mum and dad and siblings weren't home. I scanned the area yelling out, "Come out! I have a firearm and you need to leave immediately." The dogs cried standing at the door. I called one in, but he didn't want to proceed. He nuzzled me out, pushing me into the living room. I had the shotgun at the door ready and shut it. I then waited, walked away for a minute, and then rushed in, scanning the room where my pets were, and said, "Get out now, final warning." But as I scanned the room, I realized it was empty, and as I bustled in, the dogs rushed out and pushed me out too. I unloaded the magazine, waiting for anything, but nothing happened. So I put on the TV and calmed the dogs down. Just as I was calming myself and the dogs down, I hear a bummed, "Okay," and the dogs flipped out, barking and guarding me. I turned around in the direction of where I heard the sound, but there was no one there. Nothing after that. The dogs calmed down soon after. I wonder if I evicted a ghost with death threats. There has always been some general creepiness about our home. It's an old house and we've only lived in it about a year now. There have been more than a few times where it's felt like there's someone standing right behind me. I'm often torn between being too afraid to turn around and wanting to whip around really fast to look behind me. I generally don't do that because there's a chunky kitten astride my shoulder with very sharp claws who does not appreciate sudden movement. My husband and I have both heard creaking from upstairs that sounds like footsteps. Normally I rationalize that the creaking is the cats running around, but lately they are never out of my sight. Earlier this week I yelled at my husband because someone yanked on my sleeve while I was carrying a hot teapot. Someone pulled on my sleeve, nearly causing me to drop a teapot full of boiling water on myself. My husband is the only other person in the house. As I turned my head to look at him and I yelled out, "Stop, it's hot!" Then as I stood there, eyes darting owlishly around the room, I realized there was no one in the kitchen but me and the cats, and they're all looking right where I looked first, right at the spot where someone should be, but isn't. My husband jokingly called the odd behavior bodyguard mode. Having a fierce feline entourage following me everywhere is awesome, but listening to said growling entourage in unison at something I can't see, or having all three of them glare at the same corner in the room for minutes at a time with their ears pinned and their tails bristled and twitching in agitation, well, that part gives me the creeps. They've been doing it a lot, and they only do it to me. All three cats still love my husband and enjoy being around him, but if I leave the room, my kitty squad is sure to follow no matter how comfy they were. Before all this odd behavior started, a comfortable cat wouldn't so much as bother to blink if I left the room. It's not always when they're together. All three cats have been individually behaving a bit oddly as well. Havoc is a whopping 15 pounds of grey and white striped fur. He's been sleeping on my pillow for 9 years now. When he started, he was small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, and even though now his big body takes up more room than my entire head, I just don't have it in me to make him move. I actually have a hard time sleeping without him purring in my ear, even if he is a pillow hog. Havoc's bodyguard mode normally happens while I'm trying to sleep. It starts with him fluffing up like he's pissed off while intensely staring over my head towards the foot of the bed. After a while, he stands up on my pillow and just sort of crouches over my head like a fluffy, pissed off hat. Sometimes he stays there for a few minutes and then chills out and goes back to laying on the pillow. Other times, I guess, whatever is ticking him off doesn't take the hint because it's standing over my head. Doesn't do the trick, he starts growling, or at least I think he's growling. It's so low I can't hear it, but I feel him vibrating, and he definitely isn't purring. Then he creeps forwards and crouches on my back. I sleep on my stomach and he hunches himself up into a tense kitty loaf between my shoulder blades and growls that low growl. I can't see what he's looking at because if I try and move around, he will refuse to let me up. If I sit up or roll over, he digs his claws into my back. He only does it if I try and move him, so I just try and ignore the very tense spring-loaded attack cat perched on my back and try and fall asleep. Thankfully, this isn't every night. Mo is a rescue and we've had him for maybe 6 years. If I had to guess, he's probably 12 now. He's a sweet cat, but his first owner was a woman who abused him, and as a result he favours my husband, or he used to. Because of his past abuse, Mo is a bit skittish around women. He likes to sit on my husband's lap, and when I had a male roommate, he used to sit in his lap. Until 2 months ago, I couldn't count the amount of times in the last 6 years he's ever sat on a female's lap, including mine. Now, not only is he with me every time I sit down, he's with me at all times. He follows me everywhere. He freaks out if I try and close him out of a room I'm in. I'm talking, he literally yells at the door until he throws up level freak out. He's never been this attached to me before, and I love his cute face, but it's getting hard to be used to never closing a door behind me to make sure he doesn't end up accidentally shut out. He needs to be in the same room with me, and it's an odd change in behavior, and it started happening around the same time as Havoc's angry cat routine. The most protective bodyguard is our only female cat, Dot. She's 2, and we got her when she was 8 weeks old, playful and cuddly, and we still refer to her as our kitten. Until recently, she split her cuddle time pretty evenly between my husband and I, since she's been around both of us since a young age, and is completely comfortable with us. Recently though, she is almost frantic to be touching me at all times. She started riding around my shoulders like some sort of wonderfully snuggly scarf, and if I tried to stop her from getting on, she'll eventually resort to dive-bombing me from above by jumping from me from the top of the fridge, or waiting for me to sit down and then leap onto the back of the chair or countertop. She is determined to sit on my shoulder like I'm some sort of trusty steed. We joke that she's my tactical assault kitten because she follows me around the house, often sitting with her back pressed against the back of my legs while she unblinkingly stares out over the room, like she's guarding my back. I was reliably informed that the couple who rented the house years ago, one day they just up and left without saying anything to anyone, including the man who owned the house at the time. The homeowner never did manage to get a hold of them, and he tried pretty hard because he was ticked off at the shabby state they left the house in. Bob said the couple would have parties and would go on all-nighters, and tended to get a super rowdy crowd, and they had the cops called on them more than once for fights that spilled out into the yard. A guy who used to attend the parties came by the house not realizing the couple had left, and ended up having a chat with Bob. The guy said they weren't just parties, they were church, and when Bob asked what kind of religion involved the bloody fist fights at 3 a.m, the guy just shrugged and said, "If you have to ask." Then he just turned around and wandered off without another word. I don't really know what to say about the situation. I wonder if something that they did to the house was left behind, and that is what my cats are protecting me from. But what do you think? Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, be sure to let me know down below in the description. A huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. For signing up, you get a bunch of perks. You can find out what they are by following the links in the description if you are so inclined. And if you want to watch more, links on screen now. But until next time, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.